Last couple of days, 2 more policemen off, right? Killing the young black folk. Just normal. Just normal. Anybody know if that kind of killing was going on in Beverly Hills? Sookie, now. Should be major moral outrage in every corner of the country. You don't be killing these upper class white brothers and sisters like that. They're human beings. What about Jamal and Letitia? What about Juanita and Carlos? What about our indigenous brothers and sisters locked in these reservations? Oh, you normalize that and just keep moving. You deodorize it because you're afraid of the funk of your country. You don't want to deal with the funk. Well, you can't talk about hope without aspiring to be a funk master. Because that's what the funk is all about. Samuel Beckett called it the mess. Third question, what does decency do in the face of insult and assault? And what is indecent? Callousness and indifference toward the poor and vulnerable. Last question, what does courage do in the face of brute force? Hope is about being, doing, enacting, embodying, connected to quests for integrity, honesty, decency, and courage plus magnanimity, namely fortitude. So in the end, it's not about how sophisticated my discourse on hope was. It's about, at your funeral, she lived a life in which she was a hope. And she generated hope in others. That's Curtis Mayfield saying, keep on pushing. It's not a discourse on pushing. It's an enactment in the mess, in the funk, in catastrophe, in domination, in subordination, to not allow any of them to have the last word. There is no hope without a wrestling of despair. It's like Jacob in the 32nd chapter of Genesis, where he's wrestling with that angel of death in the midnight hour, and he emerges as God wrestler. That's the definition of Israel. God wrestler with new energy. It's not discourse only. I'm not against discourse, but discourse can become such a distraction. And we live in a culture that specializes in weapons of mass distraction as well as weapons of mass destruction. And it might be the case that we lose. Now in America, to talk about losing is always a dangerous thing because we live in the superficial culture of winners, you know. We got to be with the winner, got to be with the winner. No, there is something about acknowledging that you might lose that gives a gravitas to what you're doing. And then we might be surprised by the joy of the process, and sometimes you'll be surprised by some of the concrete victories.
Welcome back to a patron-only episode of the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. This is going to be something of a freestyle episode where I just have a few notes in front of me and I riff on what I'm thinking about right now, so hopefully it turns out well. I'm not sure if it'll be 20 minutes or an hour. We'll see how long it takes me to get my point across. So the core theme of this podcast is to be against Doomerism, which we're seeing a lot of online right now, a lot of essentially nihilism on the left, which I think is extremely counterproductive. And I think that it's threatening to define a huge section of the post-Bernie left. And I think that's really problematic. So before I begin, I think that I always try to not call out individuals unless they are individuals who have a long track record of being shitty. So, for example, Justin and I have called out Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald a number of times because they're lost causes to my mind at this point. They are deciding to make their career about this sort of anti-woke coalition with the right, fake populism that rejects anything that even has the smell of liberalism on it, no matter how productive or counterproductive it may be. And I think that those two are just sort of gone off the deep end. But outside of that, I try not to attack people on the individual level as much as I can help it because I think people can change. I think people do change. I think people go through rough periods and have bad takes, but ultimately what I want to do is to attack bad ideas on the left, not people who might be sort of taking on those ideas at any given time. So to that end, my purpose is generally when I talk about individuals is to talk about what they're saying, the ideas they're embodying in that moment, and not to like say they're bad people who, are permanently fixed in a position where they're not going to be useful to the left, because I've seen plenty of people who have had bad positions at one point and changed those positions pretty dramatically. And I want to allow for that space. So just a disclaimer throughout this episode that when I call people out, I'm not trying to like condemn them as individuals. I'm trying to attack ideas, because that's really what's important here. So as a kicking off point, I want to use a tweet that got me quite angry, and it was aimed at Mariam Kaba, who is at Prison Culture on Twitter. The tweet was, LOL, prison abolitionists telling people to call their Republican senators to keep RBG's seat open. Fam, I'm dead. And the idea of this tweet was that if you're somebody who thinks that we need to abolish prisons, it's absolutely silly to post senators' phone numbers on Twitter to try to rally people to get them to not vote in what will be a fundamentalist right-wing replacement of Ginsburg that's going to fundamentally transform the court to the most ideologically right-wing it's been since the 1920s, since the Lochner era. And I think there's two components here that I strongly dislike and what I want to speak out against, because this is just sort of a microcosm of a broader movement that I see happening on the left right now. But let's take this particular sort of case study, right? So the first thing is this a silly thing to do on its own terms? Is it silly if you're a prison abolitionist or a socialist? And I should just say the person in question here is a more dedicated activist than I will be. Certainly the person critiquing them will be. Like, they put in more work towards prison abolitionism than anybody that I'm aware of. It's essentially a 80-hour-a-week job for them. They're constantly trying to organize, trying to set up forums, fundraising, pushing local and state legislatures to act. Like, this is a person that does this thing full time. And I admire that greatly. And I would feel very reserved in criticizing this person as somebody who is a podcaster, right? As somebody who isn't a full-time activist trying to get something accomplished. But the idea here is that, if you're somebody like this, or if you're a socialist, that the idea that like trying to call on senators is essentially just like bourgeois and silly. And it's hilarious to think of somebody who wants to see a radically different world also engaging in what is seen as like this petty political activism to try to call senators who aren't going to listen to you anyways. So the first component is this a silly thing to do on its own terms? Is it silly to do this as a leftist? And to that I say absolutely not, right? Because what is the outcome, right? Let's say there's a 2% chance that calling these senators actually leads to a delay that allows this seat to not be filled, which I think is about the proper rating, right? I think there's probably about a 2% chance. And I should say, like, this was the night that RPG died. So at that point, there was certainly a 2% chance, knowing what we knew at the time, right? So most Republicans are probably going to be on board. We already knew that Susan Collins and Murkowski were waffling. There was a report out that Mitt Romney was considering voting no. And if that happens, that's what we need is 3 senators, right? We technically need 4 senators, but if it happens after the election, Mark Kelly in Arizona would be seated immediately because it's a special election. Anyways, it's not particularly important, but essentially we needed an extra senator other than the 2 that were committed to not voting, which is Susan Collins and Murkowski. So obviously there's a possibility here. Is it tiny? Yes, just like it was during the Kavanaugh hearings. But I still think it was a worthwhile effort to try to get Jeff Flake to vote no, to try to get Kavanaugh to not be on the court. I think that is worth spending time on. Now, if it becomes your fixation, if this is what you're going to spend a month on, taking away from your other activism, then no, of course not. But what happened here was this person posted phone numbers of senators to call on Twitter. That was what they were doing. This literally wasn't even spending time. I mean, I guess they had to Google the phone numbers of the senators. That's the time spent. They sent out his tweet. Again, this person that's a full-time activist. I should note that they changed their name to #TryEverything2020, which I think is a good response. This is exactly what what I believe in, right? This is exactly the message that they're trying to push, that we are in a desperate moment. And not only am I a prison abolitionist who's going to spend most of my time doing that, I want the system to be better. So anything I could possibly try to make it so, I'm going to do. Like, that's just worth doing. So I think this fails on its first point. The idea that trying to call on senators to try to get this 1 or 2% chance, whatever it may be, to stop the court from being the most conservative it's been in literally 100 years, I think is worthwhile. I think it's worthwhile in and of its own terms, because this is going to be a disaster. I mean, we're facing something that is horrifying. We're facing threats to labor security. We're facing threats, obviously, to a woman's right to choose. We're facing threats to corporate power. We're facing threats to everything. There's nothing that the court really cannot take on in our society. They have that privileged role. If they decide to take a case, they can rule on it, and it's going to have big implications, right? Think about Joe Biden. One of the things that he'll do that will be unequivocally a good thing, even if not far enough, of course, is to put in place executive orders around the environment. This was one of the small bright spots of the Obama presidency, as we got some decent EPA rulings. But the court has domain over all of that. They get to decide whether executive orders are constitutional. So even this small component of Biden's presidency that you should be marginally hopeful for, which again, it's just, we're talking about things like raising car emissions, right? Marginal things that take carbon out of our atmosphere that would be emitted. Those things are going to be under jeopardy under the court. Everything that we hold dear is under jeopardy under this court. So the idea that spending a few minutes trying to ensure, or even more than that spending days, hours, weeks, right? Like, this is incredibly important. It's going to affect our way of life. If there's a 1% chance, that 1% chance is worth fighting for. And I think we on the left should know that better than anybody. The idea that we've only things that seem plausible or things that we should pursue seems very, very strange from our lens, our vantage point. The second point is, what is the alternative, right? Okay, so the alternative is like, haha, bourgeois democracy is a joke. We shouldn't engage in it in any way. And there's no reason to call any senators. We shouldn't care about this Supreme Court thing. It's going to be filled anyways. It's all a power game. Who cares? Are we better off if we take that approach? Are we better off if we just say, hey, we are trying to construct socialism. We have figured out that this is not a way to get there. We should not engage in bourgeois electoral politics. We just need to engage in street activism. Are we better off? And to that, I say absolutely not. I reject that out of hand, right? So like, there's two components to this. There is the action itself worth doing. I say yes, but are we better as the alternative? And I think it's absolutely not. Like, these are ways that you build solidarity. And you can observe this. If you look at the polling of trust in the Supreme Court, it dropped dramatically after the Kavanaugh hearing, and it's never recovered. And it'll drop dramatically here. That's important. It's important that a huge mass of Americans think the Supreme Court is illegitimate. These are the type of things that when you really start to gain power, when you really start to have an avenue towards gaining mass movements, this is the groundwork. These are the type of things that allow it to happen. So people say, okay, we have an illegitimate Supreme Court. Alternatively, we see on the streets right now, Black Lives Matter protesting against police, who is an illegitimate institution who kills Black people indiscriminately. These type of things are what break down people's faith in the system. And again, I always point to look at your own life or the people that you know in your life. I almost guarantee every single person listening to this knows at least one person, if it's not themselves, who has come to leftism by seeing these type of things happen, by these type of events, by seeing the Bush administration go to war in Iraq with near unanimous Democratic support. There was nothing we could have done to stop that, but the activism to try to do so was absolutely worth it, right? It radicalized a generation. These things are where movements are built. And so that's one component of it. The other component of it is, if this Supreme Court seat gets filled, and obviously it's a strong likelihood it will. It's a 99% chance. I mean, it seems to be basically a 100% chance at this point, now that we know that no other Republican senator seems likely to defect. This makes activism harder, because now when we're trying to build a broad-based movement to try to attack capitalism and redistribute wealth and what have you, now you have a working class that has to fight on so many different fronts. If women's abortion rights are protected, that's one less thing they have to fight for. They can be in the streets marching with Black Lives Matter. They can be in union organizing or labor activism because they don't have to worry about their basic rights. If Roe versus Wade is repealed, that's a group of would-be activists who now have to at least split their time, if not spend their entire time, fighting for basic reproductive rights. That divides the movement. It divides our time. We're worse off for it. Not just worse off, and obviously it's horrible to not have reproductive rights, worse off in the same type of activism that we are now saying is the only possible avenue to revolution. You know where a lot of activism comes from right now? It comes from unions. Unions have served as a really good base for activism, and just on a basic level for attending protests, right? A lot of times unions will get time off work and they'll organize these type of protests. Now, when the Supreme Court rules back union rules and you lose your union, now you have to fight for just that. Now you don't have that platform, and you have to fight. You have to have an extra fight. Like, you lose your ability to fight from the platform that you had, and you have to now take on an extra fight to try to get your union back. This is a disaster for all types of politics, all types of working class movement-based politics. So it's not just the thing itself. There's no, and this is my big problem with what I see on the left right now, is people simply not taking their beliefs to their conclusion. I talked about this with this viral general strike thing that kept happening time and time again. It makes perfect sense to advocate for a general strike. I advocate for a general strike. A general strike is going to be necessary. But what you have to say is, if I'm going to tweet general strike now and try to push a bunch of people on Twitter to advocate for this with me, I have to think about what that means at this moment in time. Just because a general strike is good in the general sense doesn't mean it's good right now, and it's clearly not. It's clearly not when we have the biggest reserve labor force by number that we've ever had before. All you're doing is hurting the working class by claiming to help it. And you'll know that if you think through this for 5 minutes. Okay, I want to do a general strike. What does that entail? Okay, so we're all going to rise up. We have a moment here where we need commodities at a precious level that we've perhaps never faced. People are at home. People are ordering more. I think about like Amazon workers going on general strike, and this is going to disrupt supply chains. This is a good thing. Okay, well, what happens next? Maybe that in and of itself is a good thing. It's good for Amazon to be disrupted. But what happens next? What happens next is all those people get laid off, and there's 5 people waiting for every single job opening. They have no problem laying you off. No problem whatsoever. So we have to think these things through. And that's the main thing that I advocate for in this moment in time. We don't need a brand of leftism that has X, Y, and Z tenets. We need a leftism that is smart about the way it proceeds going forward. It has to be, or else we will fail. And being smart first takes learning the consequences of your actions. I see the same thing right now with this revolutionary fervor because people are disillusioned with electoral politics. And they'll say the only way for socialism is an armed uprising. And maybe that's true. Maybe it is the case that the only possible way we can ever achieve a better world is through armed revolution. But what does armed revolution look like in the United States in 2020? It looks like mass murder of the population. There's no conceivable world where the government wouldn't just crush any leftist movement, especially an unorganized one. Maybe if we had a really, really well-organized working class of millions of people, that would be a different discussion. Right now, if you try to have an armed insurrection, the most people you're probably going to get in any given group is going to be maybe a couple hundred if you're lucky. That would be amazing if you got a couple hundred people to engage in this activity. You're going to be slaughtered. So we have to think about our advocacy and what it means, its actual logical conclusions. We have to think these things through. And I feel like these tweets about like, haha, prison abolitionist wants to call senator is exactly this problem. Well, okay, let's take that on face value and think it through. Is the left better off if this person doesn't do that? Absolutely not. Objectively not, in my view. They're objectively worse off. Both in the tiny, tiny infinitesimal possibility that this thing gets stopped, which would be a good thing, but also it doesn't help us as activists in any given way to just be doomer and give up on this shit. And I worry now because I feel like the end of the Bernie Sanders campaign should have been a setback. I expected a setback. Justin and I talked about, this is going to be a setback. There's no doubt about it. We had hope. And more importantly, we had a left who was being constructive almost across the board. And that was a really nice moment. Right? So you saw the Chapo Trap House people during the Bernie campaign. They didn't get any less crude about their politics, which is what people liked about them from the start, right? They weren't any less aggressive and calling out shitty people and sort of digging under the surface for the way the ruling class operates. But what they were is focused. They didn't wake up and see some hilarious tweet and that was going to be the fixation of their day and they were going to make a podcast about it, or read a funny book from Ben Shapiro, or read an article from David Brooks in the New York Times. And I should say, like, that's my shit. I love that. I am somebody who's been so deeply involved in this media world and who writes for what publication and the dog shit they're spewing, that like it just feels good to have somebody reaffirm that I'm not crazy when I read a David Brooks column and think about how ridiculous it is. So I personally love that shit. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, of course, right? There's all kinds of podcasts out there that are built for comedy, and that's a thing that should happen. There should be funny podcasts. There should be silly political podcasts that satirize our moment. Of course, that stuff's all necessary. But during the Bernie campaign, they used their platform in an organized and focused way because they realized, okay, here's an actual opportunity to build a left, and we want to do everything we can to help it. That's what I want to see from the left. And so I knew that stuff was going to go away. I knew we were going to see a setback because people were going to not see that the fight before Bernie was the same fight after. I knew that was going to happen. I expected that. The problem is it hasn't just served as a setback. It hasn't just served as a kick in the nuts that we have to recover from. It's served as a dissolution. It's served as fragmentation. There are now different groups of responses on the left, which have now defined different sort of sects, basically. And that sucks because we had focus. That was the beautiful thing about the Bernie Sanders campaign, is almost everyone on the left had focus. We weren't fucking around anymore. We all had this mission in mind, and that's unifying. And we need that. And so the way that Justin and I responded to that was to see it as a setback. Yeah, it sucks that Bernie's gone, but our mission is the same, and we keep fighting, and we find the new platform on which to fight. And I'm proud of our response to that. We did not engage in any kind of doomerism. Of course it sucks, but that's not wallowing in sadness. Doesn't help anybody. Hope is praxis. You have to engage in that. You just have to. Let me step back here for a second to ask why we should care. Right? Because one of the theses of the very people I'm critiquing in this podcast is that media doesn't matter, right? That's all just sort of bourgeois navel gazing. Nobody actually gives a shit what the media says. Nobody cares about, sort of this elite world of people who have gone to college and read books and say things on podcasts. And I reject that out of hand. I think that this is the area where I definitively favor Hegel over Marx. Right? Because Marx said it wasn't about ideas, it was about material relations. That's just, to me, fundamentally, clearly untrue. Ideas really, really, really matter. My working theory is that when you read and understand Marx, you realize that he's right for the wrong reasons. And when you read Hegel, you realize that he's wrong for the right reasons. And this is exactly what I mean, right? The way that a working class is formed and the ideas that it takes on determine its politics. And we've seen this happen throughout history. The way that Lenin and the Bolsheviks advocated for, taught, educated, and operationalized their ideology had a huge impact on both the revolution itself and the post-revolutionary movement. We saw the same in Cuba. Fidel had formed an ideology after he met Che, and when they came back by boat and fled into the Sierra Maestra and fought this revolution against Batista, the ideology that they had developed, partially when Castro was in prison, was hugely influential to the way that he governed. It defined the left movement. That's how these things work. To think of this as pure material relations is a mistake. Ideas really do matter. And they matter to the actual outcome as well as the process. There's all kinds of good ways that this operates. I think that Cuba's traveling medical system was one thing that Fidel learned from his time studying theory and how you have to reach working people. This also takes bad forms, right? So we saw Jews be treated horribly in the Soviet Union. In Cuba, we saw gay men be treated horribly in military units. Trans people have been treated horribly by all kinds of leftist movements throughout history. This stuff matters. It just does. And so when we're in this media ecosystem of we have this growing left, undoubtedly, it's the biggest by pure number that it's ever been in this country, probably, and how it defines itself as it grows and creates this sort of parameters of acceptable discussion and what we're actually fighting for, and who's allowed in and who's not allowed in. And more importantly, what ideas are allowed to be dominant and what aren't, right? Any set of social relations is going to have some hegemonic ideas. That's the state of the world. There's no escaping that, right? We're not going to have this egalitarian thing where the left is just whatever you define it as, right? Like this sort of postmodern structure where we don't have dominant narratives. That's just not the way the world functions. The left's going to have a dominant narrative. And so far, I don't think that we've necessarily built one. We've hinted at some of them, and some of them are baked in. Like Medicare for All is going to be a central tenet of any left movement, which is a good thing. I think actually a fantastic thing. It's a great way to reach out to people. I think it is the most brilliant part of the Bernie campaign. It seems so simple to us, but he didn't have to do that. An alternative Bernie campaign could have been like, we are focusing on unions. We're going to get our power through unions. We've seen left movements do that. And that would have been a huge mistake, not because unions aren't incredibly important and not because unions aren't exactly the direction we need to go in, but because 10% of the population is in a union, growing them is really difficult. And so having that kind of a base to try to activate the working class wouldn't have been a good thing. So Bernie going after Medicare for All, knowing that the main weakness in the United States is our healthcare system, that is sort of at the intersection of every other class issue, that without healthcare security, especially in a country as sick as ours, you can't really do anything else. So that was brilliant, and that's going to be a tenet. But many of the other tenets are up for debate. They're up for grabs. And the idea that podcasters and YouTube hosts who get millions and millions of downloads and plays each month aren't going to be significant to defining our movement makes no sense. There are not that many of us. The fact that this many people are listening to some of these people means that this is literally a huge proportion of people who call themselves left in the United States, of the most committed people who are going to be likely at the core of the movement because they've been here since 2015 or so, or maybe even more recently. But if we're fast forwarding to 2026, say, when we have some great leap forward for one reason or another, these are likely to be people that lead movements, or at least influence movements, because they've been around for the longest time. So it matters. It just does matter. We can't ignore the type of leftism being advanced by platforms that most of the most committed leftists are listening to. We just can't. Right? We're still tiny in forming our identity. Another thing to say here is that socialism is not an outcome, it's a process. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I think it's something that we need to internalize. Socialism is not what happens at the end. It's not when workers own the means of production, then there's some end point there, and that's when we've achieved socialism, and then boom, that's the end point. We've reached it. That's not how it works. It's a process. It's a constant process. It's never ending. This is also why I think Marx can be silly when he talks about, basically sort of end conception of history where we destroy class relations. Not only is that a utopianism, but even in such a society, we would still be engaging in social relations that are going to change our society over time. It's never static. It's never fixed. There's no intelligent design of an algorithm that ends at point Z of full communism. And to that end, it's not linear. It's always in motion. This is where Hegel would say each stage of history develops a new dialectic, which we then struggle within. That's socialism as process, not as outcome. And this is why, in many ways, I think it's silly to try to define myself as some narrow sect of leftism. I just call myself a socialist because I believe that workers should own the means of their production, and that the point of distribution is a fair allocation of resources to all people regardless of their abilities. But to say that I am, this sect of leftism, I think, is to say there is some outcome that I believe can be achieved when I don't. And I also believe that these things are determined by social relations and material conditions. So, for example, maybe we get our act together on climate change relatively soon. There's some good carbon capture technology, and we exist in a world that is worse than the one we live in now, undoubtedly. But we stop at 2.2 degrees of warming. There are some unlivable places. It's hotter. There are worse weather conditions, but we don't live in hell. We just live in a world with worse weather and less biodiversity. That seems to me to be a plausible, if not at all certain outcome of what could happen in coming years. Leftism under such a world looks differently than leftism when we get to 3.3 degrees warming and life really is fundamentally different and we've had to adapt our species. It also looks different in the Nordic countries versus the United States versus Mexico versus Latin America versus France. So I say material conditions and social relations are going to determine the type of society that we're going to see. We all want to strive towards some North Star, always. We always want to have a goal in mind, and we always want to work towards that and get as close to it as possible. So we're not just having social relations in every direction. We're heading towards something. But the kind of relations that we develop in this moment in time are going to influence the social relations of the future, hopefully in a better world that's heading towards socialism. Okay, so let me be a little bit more specific on the troubling trends that I see. I think there are essentially two negative strains of leftism that have emerged post-Bernie and now are quickly dominating the left. And again, it's worth noting that the three biggest podcasts on the left by a mile are Chapo Trap House, Red Scare, and TrueAnon. These podcasts have a combined 60,000 patrons. So for a leftist movement that essentially didn't exist 6 years ago in any organized capacity, this is a shit ton. These are people that are actually willing to pay $5 a month or whatever to get extra content. That's only a fraction of total listenership. These are people that are getting millions of downloads each month. Again, we're not that many. We are not legion. A lot of fucking people are listening to this podcast. A huge portion of the people who consider them left are listening to these podcasts, these sources. So I think the two strains that have developed are a Nietzschean will to power left and an own the libs left. And I'll go deeply into what I mean. But I think both of them rightly understand that power is what matters, but neither of them tend to actually understand power. So let me spell this out. So the story with Nietzsche, which I think is an interesting one and a telling one in some ways, is that Nietzsche wrote and then died in 1900, right? And he wrote a lot of stuff about power and about clashes of civilization, kind of, and about what individuals should strive to in terms of their ethic, and he wrote about morality. And after he died, the Nazis took him on. He is referenced explicitly multiple times in Mein Kampf, and he was Hitler's philosopher. There's no doubt about it. So the prevailing wisdom was, obviously, that Nietzsche was a Nazi. A few decades pass after World War II. Academic named Walter Kaufmann picks up Nietzsche, reads him, and says, actually, this stuff has all been misinterpreted. And it definitely was misinterpreted because his sister, who sided with the Nazi Party, took his work after his death and sort of rewrote it to be more favorable to Nazis. So people have probably heard about the Ubermensch, right? This is the basis of Superman. And the Ubermensch was used in Nazi Germany to mean the white Aryan race, things like that. So after Kaufmann, there's been this revival that says, oh, actually Nietzsche wasn't a far-right individual. He wasn't particularly political, and we should reread him and maybe use him for the left. And we've seen some Nietzschean strains in the left emerge. And now, weirdly, they've taken over, I think, in many ways, this kind of edgelord left space. Well, it turns out if you actually read Nietzsche, the people reading him before Kaufmann were more right than the people reading him now. Nietzsche's idea was that there was going to be a clash of civilizations. Nietzsche didn't like nationalism, which people use in his favor, but he didn't like nationalism because it was too narrow. He thought it was silly to just clash within your country and try to build something. You should have, regional, global clashes of ideology. And Nietzsche predicted that. And so I've talked about in this podcast before the idea of God is dead and we have killed him from Nietzsche. And the idea there is that there is no external morality which we can derive our own from. There is no, there's still Christians, but people don't actually live by biblical codes anymore. You're Christian, but it's essentially a separate set of your life. The way that you decide to act in the real world and real interactions with people and in politics is different from the ones that you discuss when you're in the church. And that's undoubtedly true for 99% of people, especially Christians, right? They're not actually trying to say like, okay, this book is divine commandment from God. I'm going to read every line and try to live my life in direct accordance with this. No. They're deriving their own secular morality, and then oftentimes they try to justify it using the Bible. And Nietzsche's right about this. This is the way the modern world functions. God is dead and we have killed him. There is no external source that we can use to guide our actions. And so in such a world, Nietzsche's other, perhaps most famous phrase was the will to power. And the idea here is essentially that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And so what Nietzsche said was Jews and Christians and his day's social justice warriors were essentially inventing these weak-willed identity issues and issues of some divine morality. Like, he hated Christianity because he thought Christianity was like this puny idea. And remember what Christianity actually is, right? Obviously, there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible that can be used for horrific ends. We all know that, right? But this idea of all men being created equal and with dignity also comes from Christianity. That is fundamentally a Christian idea. It actually is. Nietzsche thought that was nonsense. The world is about power relations. Some people are more capable and powerful than others. Some people are destined to achieve great things when they're born, and some people are destined to do absolutely nothing. And so society should be run by those that are the greatest. Right? How could we have a functioning society if we allow everybody to be equal and we just take away from all these strong people who are individually great and were literally born, put on this earth to be great? They're so talented. They have so much ability. They should be the ones that advance society. They always have been historically. Why would we change that now? So Nietzsche said that Christianity was essentially trying to subvert this order. This is obviously a very anti-Semitic invention, but Nietzsche said that he admired Jews greatly because Jews were able to take their oppression and then create this moral framework that said the people that did the oppression were bad people and not just exerting their power. Nietzsche thought that was brilliant, a brilliant way to stop being oppressed. If you just redefine morality such that people who oppress are worse than the people who are being oppressed. Nietzsche wrote, quote, "Even the body within which individuals treat others as equals will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living and because life simply is will to power." He also wrote that Christian morality, quote, "has waged deadly war against this higher type of man. It has placed all the basic instincts of his type under ban." So again, Nietzsche thought like prescriptively, like the way the world ought to be is that great powerful men should drive the world forward. And that these conceptions of morality were crafted such that the great men of society were brought down. They're only hurt from this. Which is, of course, true, right? Like, kind of the conception of morality, you could define at the most basic level, is that, like, super strong people shouldn't just be able to do whatever they want to everybody else who is weaker than them. And so, when I talk about a Nietzschean left, I think that the left, in many ways, the section of the left, has replaced the idea of God being dead and we have killed him with God being dead and capitalism has killed him. So there is no morality under a capitalist system. There's no social relations that can be productive because capitalism is all-encompassing. It's so powerful. And ironically, I think this reifies capitalism as an all-encompassing force. These people that believe that capitalism is everywhere. It's in our pores. It's every single social relation. There's nothing outside of it. There's really no way to overcome it without actually overcoming it. It's kind of revolution or bust, right? As long as we have any segment of capitalism, society is disastrous and exploitative. The Nordic countries are not worthwhile projects because they're still capitalist. You know, Spotify came out of Sweden, so nothing that Sweden does can possibly be good because of that. I'm always amazed, actually, at how powerful these people reify capitalism to be, almost as if capitalism is an object. It's this all-powerful object. But that's not what capitalism is, right? It's value in motion. It's exploitation through a million different market microtransactions. Capitalism is diffuse in many ways, and that's a concept that many people cannot wrap their heads around in terms of seeing capitalism almost in a hierarchy. Like it's godlike, right? Like what replaced the god of the ancient world is now capitalism. And ironically, that's true in some sense in terms of the mystical value that we give to capitalism in terms of this very thing. But it itself is not some property of the universe that is too powerful to possibly overcome. And thinking in this way naturalizes capitalism as a way of the world such that it's inescapable, it's all-encompassing, and there's nothing that can possibly be done to push back against it. And this is where the Chapo, Red Scare, and TrueAnon group tends to fall, as well as people like Bhaskar Sankara. We live under this totalizing form of capitalism, and the only thing that matters under such a world is will to power. It's basically a contingent form of nihilism. If it's the case that we have to live under capitalism, which dominates every single thing we can do and is inescapable, then nothing matters. The only thing worth fighting for is to overthrow capitalism. Every fight that falls short of overthrowing capitalism, or at least doesn't have overthrowing capitalism as its end goal, isn't worth fighting for. The Red Scare people, and to a slightly lesser extent TrueAnon, explicitly argue this. This is the rise of the anti-woke left. Because keeping with the Nietzsche analogy, wokeness is the same as Christian morality. It's just the weak imposing a fake structure to try to limit the powerful. The only thing that matters in this world is who's in power and who's not. And the only way you can get in power is to exert it. And so all this social justice ideology is just you post hoc justifying your oppression and trying to make the oppressor look bad. It's the same thing. All this trans stuff, right? This is all just created out of thin air because we feel oppressed and we want to find a way to make the oppressor deemed immoral by society. So for example, Red Scare literally says sexual assault complaints basically fall into this category. They say that most complaints of sexual assault are just women who had bad sex or feel embarrassed. And that makes sense under this worldview. That makes sense if you believe in the Nietzschean will to power. That we're inventing these things whole cloth to try to subvert the powerful in society. Some time ago, I posted a screenshot in the Discord of Liz Franzik sharing straight up anti-trans propaganda, but from a quote-unquote leftist angle. Because this trans ideology is all just a reproduction of the neoliberal subject. We're all individuals and therefore you can be whatever you want. That's literally their critique. And one of the big problems here, and this sort of converts with the other form of leftism that I'll talk about shortly, is that they conflate neoliberalism itself with neoliberalism co-opting left movements. Right? So if you push a movement that can get co-opted by liberalism, neoliberalism, what have you, whatever you want to define it as, that movement itself must be liberal or neoliberal. So Black Lives Matter isn't an organization that's worth a damn because D-Ray can take Black Lives Matter, make it friendly to the establishment, package it, and make it a weak piece of legislation that might pass during the Biden era that won't actually change anything. See the distinction there? that any movement that can be co-opted by neoliberalism is therefore itself neoliberal. This is a conflation and a mistake that's like the most clear logical fallacy you could possibly think of, but it forms the basis for what many of these people talk about. And to be frank, it's easy and lazy, but easy to do. Because I can talk about all day how much I dislike the hashtag #MeToo movement, because hashtag #MeToo has basically been focused on already rich and famous people who have been sexually assaulted by other rich and famous people. And that should be addressed in some form in society. I don't think rich and famous women deserve that, of course, in any way. And they should absolutely fight against it. And in fact, it can be helpful to see somebody who is seen as having power in society face the same kind of disgusting predation that working women face every day. But Me Too itself has been purely an elite movement. It has not helped working people at all. A real Me Too movement would be focusing on, servers in restaurants dealing with their manager harassing them. But they don't care about that. It's all about an actress who had to deal with Harvey Weinstein, which again is obviously horrible. But it's not the kind of working class anti-sexual assault movement that we need. It had nothing to do with that. It really never did. Hopefully that movement led to non-powerful people being willing to recognize their oppression, come to terms with it, and hopefully maybe confront it in some circumstances where that was the best thing to do. But that's the best that could possibly come out of that movement, because it wasn't providing anything really for working people. And maybe if they threw millions and millions of dollars into a network around the country to where working women could anonymously, call in and get legal help or what have you, that's one thing. But this movement was instead sort of like this whole like cultural phenomenon of we're going to take down rich and powerful men. And obviously, good fucking riddance to all those men. I'm glad they're all gone. I hope it keeps going. But it's easy to critique Me Too because it deserves to be critiqued. But then there's a thin line there, and this is the line that's crossed so often by the section of the left, between yes, Me Too is mostly bourgeois and it's mostly for white women. It's essentially a liberal white women movement. That does not mean that sexual assault isn't an extremely important issue in society. I would argue it's up there among our most important issues. If you go back and listen to my Feminism for the 99% two-part series, I read off some of the statistics of how impactful sexual assault is to women. It is not only a trauma that women hold with them for the rest of their lives in many cases, it has literal impacts on their ability to stay housed, on their ability to have financial security. This is a huge, huge deal. It's something that needs to be addressed. So you can either look at the Me Too movement and say, okay, this movement itself has a narrow scope to liberal women in Hollywood, basically. Or you can say, because this movement sucks in terms of its official iteration, then all complaints broadly about sexual assault and its impacts are just bourgeois nonsense, no matter who it's coming from. Doesn't matter if it's working women or rich white liberal women. Okay, so that's one new left tendency, this will to power nihilism. And it really is a deep nihilism that says that, and I call it a contingent nihilism. It's nihilism as long as capitalism still exists, but they also reify capitalism as all-encompassing and powerful. The only way to improve life, the only thing worth fighting for is a complete overthrow of capitalism. So short of that, you're just living in nihilism. Social relations and media don't matter. That's all bourgeois and not what the real working class cares about, right? The real working class doesn't care about trans people. They care about Marxist surplus value. This is unironically the position of so many of these people, right? We talked about when Matt Taibbi went on Chapo, and essentially his thesis was that a lot of black people actually don't like Black Lives Matter, and most working people actually like the cops. And Justin and I dissected how, one, sure, that's something that we can deal with in some sense. It is the case that there are a lot of people in this country who like cops. But two, this is a social relation, and social relations can be transformed and must be transformed if we're to achieve the world we want to see. So your takeaway from the fact that working class people like cops, which I don't even think is true, but let's just take Matt Taibbi's claim at face value, which again, his evidence is that he talked to some people in the corner where Eric Garner was, and they had debates over whether cops were good or bad. But let's take that claim as true. The solution is not then, let's stop talking about abolishing the police or defunding the police, as I think is a better slogan, or reforming the police, or any police action. Let's just ignore all that, which is essentially the implication from their argument. Our solution is not to give up on our movement. Our solution is to convince people, understand why they might enjoy police, because police are on the front line of every single activity they engage in, essentially, right? Yes, you see cops on every single corner. You see cop cars on every single intersection. Anytime there's ever been a problem in your life, police have been involved, because police are involved with every fucking problem in this country. Yes, it makes sense that some people are going to like the cops because of that, especially those who haven't been explicitly treated shittily, and even some of those who have. Because maybe a cop beat you up one time, but maybe a cop also showed up when there was a robbery. Maybe you see them as a necessary evil. I'm sure there's a bunch of complex feelings people have about cops, but again, the solution is to recognize the social relation that's going on here. Recognize that cops are the government that people interact with most often, and keep pushing even more fervently to reimagine those social relations. Nobody should like cops. Cops in the United States are not meant to be liked. Literally, they're not designed to be liked. We're unique in that way. Cops in the UK are more designed to be liked. They have built trust with their population by not carrying around weapons. And I'm sure there are people in the UK that have problems with police, but at least their explicit design is literally to protect and serve. Whether they achieve that or not is another question. But cops in the United States are not designed to do that. They're literally not designed to do that. They're meant to police. They're meant to control communities. That is their explicit charter. So when we hear, and again, let's just take it as true, that a segment of the working class likes cops, our solution should be, holy shit, we need to work on changing that. We need to make sure that when there's a domestic dispute, somebody's coming that can actually handle the fucking domestic dispute. When there's somebody who has schizophrenia, who's having an episode on the street corner, that we have somebody come that's a medical professional, equipped to deal with them and not hurt them, and try to improve their lives from that situation, both their lives and the lives of those they're interacting with, maybe dangerously in some cases. Not a guy with a gun that's going to come over and escalate the situation. And fucking sometimes is going to come murder the guy. You call the police to try to help somebody on the corner who's screaming. Fucking 30 minutes later, they end up dead. We need to rebuild these social relations. But the idea that the working class only cares about their labor exploitation is patently absurd. I would go as far as to say that working people objectively, at least in the United States, care more about at least one issue of identity than they care about labor exploitation, because many of them have no idea that they're even being exploited. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't win them over on class issues, right? It's very easy to convince people that they're being exploited. But I know in my own personal life, I've had to explicitly explain this idea of exploitation for people to realize they were being exploited. So in other words, the fact that they're being exploited means that you can win them over. It doesn't take much to convince an American that the boss is stealing the surplus value of their labor. That's pretty obvious for almost every job in the United States. But it's not a fucking preset package. Babies aren't born in the womb with an understanding of Marx. There's nothing implicit in you going to work and making $15 an hour that makes you realize that you're actually creating $30 an hour or $40 an hour, or $100 an hour. It takes deep thinking to understand that. It's not something that just is fucking baked in. And that's what these people think. The working class cares about that. They care about the fact that they're being exploited at work, but they don't care about trans people. That's the reactionary take of some of this section of the left. I think it's extremely counterproductive. It's going to lead to bad outcomes. If we allow this type of thinking to pervade, even if we win, we're going to have a movement that isn't based in solidarity for trans people, because we decided along the way that real working class politics doesn't deal with trans issues, because those are just identity issues. Those are just will to power issues. That's just a fake morality used to subvert the order of things, which is about class domination. Okay, so that takes care of that tendency. The other emerging left tendency, which I need a better name for, and I will come up with one eventually, is this own the libs leftism. They also believe in power, but almost in the exact opposite way. To them, gaining power is about owning people and dunking on liberals, and everything liberals do is bad, because they're liberals. The Hill's Rising is the most blatant example of this, but it also explains people like Jimmy Dore and Kyle Kulinski. The problem with this type of politics is that it doesn't win anybody over ever. There's no appeal to anybody who doesn't already agree with you. You're either being used by the right, as we see on Rising, or you're just speaking to the choir. So it's useful to think about how Marx saw himself. Marx saw himself as the completion of the liberal Enlightenment project. Marx said, you believe, he didn't actually say this, but this was essentially his underlying belief. You believe in liberal values, you believe in individualism, you believe in liberty, fraternity, and egalitarianism? Well, guess who can provide that for you? Socialist. That's our movement. True liberty is when you're not exploited by your boss. True liberty is when you can choose what to do for work. True liberty is when you have mobility. True brotherhood and egalitarianism comes when you have a classless society. We are the completion of the liberal project. And that's important framing to think about, right? Why are we dunking on liberals all the time if we eventually want to win them over? And if we don't want to win them over, then we're going to lose. We don't have enough numbers. The reason our movement is as big as it is because we pulled liberals over. We pulled liberals over in 2015 when Bernie ran. We pulled liberals over in 2020 when Bernie ran again. We pulled liberals over by being there when they see the failures of the system. When people say, like, geez, why isn't Obama doing anything? Well, here's why. Geez, why is Trump so fucking awful? Well, here's why. Geez, why did Hillary lose the election? Well, here's why. We've won people over like that. It doesn't seem like it because the most loud voices are those that, refuse to be convinced. But this is how we win. This is how you build movements. And leftists throughout history have always understood this. Lenin and Marx were very attuned to the idea that we need to win over more people. And our most likely allies, outside of obviously people who are already with our tendency and progressives, is liberals. You just sort of work your way across the political spectrum. Sure, we might be able to appeal to some right-wingers, working class precarity, but that's much less likely than a liberal's precarity. Because we're talking about working people here, right? And many of the people that we like, when we're talking about Twitter, obviously when we talk about liberals, we're almost always talking about liberals who are affluent, who are well off, or at least upper middle class, right? But as a population, the people that you win over are the people who believe that women should be equal, who believe that we should have higher wages, who believe that people should have health care, who have sympathy towards blacks and Hispanics and trans people. That's the base from which we draw. And we're not going to win them all. We might not win most of them. But in many ways, if you believe in this theory, kind of the socialism or barbarism idea that we're going to face a choice at some point in the near future between fascism and socialism, and I think if you've been paying attention to the news in the last few days, you'll probably agree that's the case, as the president explicitly says he's going to extend his power in the White House. Right? And just as a side note, just to touch on this story really quick, which I'm sure Justin and I will do a podcast about soon, I think that we're having this it can't happen here moment, where we assume that Trump won't hold on to power because he's too uncomfortable with standing up to the military or what have you. There's all kinds of theories about it. And most of them I agree with, actually, right? Like I've discussed in the past, I don't think it's the modal outcome that Trump stays in office, but he's now telling us in no unclear terms, this is what he's going to do. these ballots are fucked up. I'm going to have a continuation in office. He literally said that. He said, I need a ninth Supreme Court justice so that when the election has to be decided, we're going to do Bush v. Gore all over again. He's telling us this to our face. So anyways, if you believe that we're going to have a choice between socialism and barbarism, we better have a goddamn good pitch for people to make that choice. And I believe in that fundamentally. I believe we are getting to the point where we're going to have to make a choice between socialism or barbarism. And by we, I mean society. And so if we've turned off all the liberals by spending all of our time dunking on them, good luck. Many of them are already leaning towards siding with the right, especially if it's not somebody uncouth like Trump. We don't want to lose these people. And that's not to say we can't critique them. Justin and I sit and critique liberals in this podcast more than anything else. We've done, at this point, 50 plus hours on it probably. But we need to be constructive. We need to offer people something. We need to appeal to their underlying beliefs. And liberals, in the most broad sense, believe many of the same things that we do. And maybe they add to it. Yes, I believe in equality and I believe in people having health care and all these things. I just believe the best way to get there is a market economy. What that means is we have the base. We have most of it. We just have to convince them that the economic system they advocate doesn't work. And that's not hard to do. Its failures are all around us. That's why we've won the people that we have. But if we decide to burn every single bridge, that everything liberals do is bad, that when liberals fight for equality, they by definition are not actually fighting for it, and so we should just shit on them at all times, rather than seeing like, oh, they do think women should be equal, but they haven't really figured out that women being equal means socialist feminism and not breaking glass ceilings and letting, a bunch of young women think they could be Hillary Clinton. We have to take that position. We have to take the constructivist approach, or we're not going to win these people. And if we don't win these people, we're going to lose overall. So those are the stakes. Maybe you just think that we don't want to win over liberals because we're disgusted by them and their theory of politics. All right, but I think that leaves us in a really bad place for the future. And ask yourself, if the question is socialism versus barbarism, is socialism going to win that? Is that going to be the answer from the population? So think about the two crowds that I've talked about. Think about this nihilist Nietzschean left and this own the libs left. This is a massive, massive proportion. Think about combining the audiences of Jacobin, Chapo, Red Scare, TrueAnon, The Hill Rising, Jimmy Dore, and Kyle Kulinski. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of plays and downloads. This is hugely influential. There are not that many of us. So one way we've seen this play out, and I think this is kind of an intersection of these two left movements that I think are extremely negative, is Michael Moore's most recent movie about climate change, which is just incredibly, incredibly depressing because Michael Moore is undoubtedly the most watched left filmmaker, maybe Oliver Stone, but at least like currently actively making movies, especially on these documentaries that are supposed to like give you a takeaway for how to view the world. He has a new documentary about climate change, and it's gotten millions and millions of views. And essentially the theme of the movie is a Malthusian one. And what I mean by Malthusian one is the idea that essentially the only way society can function long term is to limit its population. That the problem is we have too many people here on this earth consuming too many resources. Basically, Moore's movie says the green energy movement is funded by billionaires, and he uses a bunch of like disgustingly outdated data to show that many of the green energy technologies are just as harmful for us as fossil fuels. And I'm not here, at least in this podcast, to pick apart the factual problems of the movie, although that would probably be worth doing in the future because I think it's extremely dangerous. And if any one of our patrons has seen it, you should let me know because we should talk through all the things that it gets wrong. But essentially the movie is totalizing and naturalizing in capitalism. That doesn't matter if you're producing fossil fuels or if you're producing green energy. It's all the same. The only way we can grow our economy, the only way we can provide for people at our current population rate is to destroy the planet. Doesn't matter if it's fossil fuels or renewables. So the only way to fix our problems is to just stop consuming and limit our population size. And again, this stems from the nihilism of one part of the left and this own the libs flattening of distinctions on the other part of the left. So Think about this sentiment that we hear that you can go on Twitter and see right now. The parties are the exact same. Democrats and Republicans are the exact same. The problem with this sentiment is that the parties are not an entity. They're not a thing. They're loosely tied political formations in constant motion. The Democratic Party includes former homeless socialist Cory Bush and Nancy Pelosi, who's worth $100 million. My problem with the way people talk about political parties is they talk about them as if they are a thing. They're not a thing. They're not an object. They're hardly an organization. When you think about state, local, national politics, to think of Democrats as like this entity is silly. It's a broad tent organization. When people talk about taking over the Democratic Party, I don't know if that can be done or not. I think it's the most viable option we have. But my feelings aside, it could conceivably be taking over. That's a thing that can happen because there's nothing about the Democratic Party that stops it from being so. That might sound weird to you, but it's true. The Democratic Party is a label. It's a label of an organization. The people who ran that organization are fully different people than those who ran that organization 20 years ago. They happen to all have basically the same ideology. So obviously I'm not saying the Democrats aren't fucking horrible and they haven't reproduced and they aren't being funded by billionaires, all that, of course, right? But the Democrat is not a thing that exists. It's just a loosely tied label for an organization. But if we think that the Democratic Party is this thing, the Republican Party is this thing, they're no different from each other, they cannot be changed, they're not in motion, they're not things that can be, manipulated and either changed from the bottom up or the top down, that they're just like this like fixed entity, and they engage in very similar politics to the Republicans, maybe they fight on a few different issues. And they also exert full political power over our system, which they do. We live in a fundamentally two-party system where a third party can't even sniff the idea of having power, not just for the president, but basically in any seat in the country. Obviously, there's a couple, but like broadly speaking, there's no power in any state for any other party. So if it's the case that Democrats are the same as Republicans, they're this fixed object that's horrible, and they have absolute power, there's literally nothing to fight for. And this is where the more thing stems from. We can't have a green energy movement because it's just the flip side of the same coin. Everything is. It's run by liberals, and liberals are just like Republicans. Billionaires are involved in the green movement, so therefore, by definition, it's bad. Liberals are involved, so it's bad. There's no distinctions in our political system. If that's true, then we're doomed. There's nothing worth fighting for. You're right, there is no reason to call on your senators to vote against RBG's pick. There is no reason to fight for a green energy movement. Because everybody's doing the same thing. There's Democrats, Republicans, they're the same party. Maybe they differ on gay marriage or something, but like, they're the same thing. They run everything. Might as well just give up. Okay, so then obviously the next question is, what do we do? So here's my broad prescription. I think we need to start from a place of solidarity, not homogeneity. And so what I mean by that is that we're not a mass of workers who only thinks in terms of our economic situation, right? That's the problem with this Nietzschean left. That's the problem with a lot of these left podcasts that have massive audiences, that they think that like the working class should be homogenous, that in a just world, we have a movement that's just about people's economic precarity. And if it's just about your economic precarity, it doesn't matter if you're white or black. It matters how much surplus value is being extracted from you. That's a movement that tries to homogenize. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. We don't think only in terms of our economic situation. That's just not the way that people think. There are also social relations. And social relations actually determine economic relations. This is where MMT is useful for the left and Marx can be counterproductive. A lot of Marxist analysis relies heavily on this fixed pie fallacy, right? So all we can do is distribute the resources that we already have, that already exist in our current production schema, right? We have some level of production, we're producing thing X, Y, and Z, and so what we want to do is have workers own that, or at least have heavily redistribution of those profits. Where MMT comes in, at least the left version of MMT, is it says that resources are made. They're not extracted. They're not some feature of the natural world that has always been a resource. They're created. Who gives a shit about coltan before we do? Right? There's this element, mostly in Africa, that nobody ever gave a fuck about. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, let's say 1980, when people start building personal computers, and then cell phones come along, all of a sudden this coltan element is one of the most important on the planet. And warlords are cutting off people's hands to, get enough of this element to ship off to the West for a massive profit. Who gives a shit about ones and zeros or AI and 3D printing? And the important thing to note here is that the Industrial Revolution didn't happen because there's some natural historical force that says that we should burn coal. That was a choice. We did not have to burn coal. There's nothing prescriptive about history that says we needed to burn coal. We could be living in a timeline right now, and it could look very similar to the one that we currently live in, where coal was never burned. That was a choice that we made. It's a power source. If we would have the same investment from day one to say, like, you know what, the sun hits the earth every day, maybe we can harness it. There's a good chance we would just use solar power right now. That's not inconceivable. Think about the money, the billions and billions and billions of dollars that got poured into researching coal production. What if we went elsewhere? This was a choice. The Industrial Revolution was a choice. And this is where I have to critique the anti-MMT left. So Matt Brunig, Justin's boy, is one of these people. And people have, in their disputes with him, called him a neoliberal Marxist. I think that's pretty funny, but also kind of descriptive. Where Matt and others of his ilk have accepted all the terms of capitalism. They've accepted these utility functions and production functions and essentially the current makeup of the state, right? This is the idea of the sovereign wealth fund. That yes, this country is going to profit off oil X amount, but we should have people invested. We should have human beings that have stock in the country's oil production so that at least we can redistribute these resources back. Maybe the planet's still going to be destroyed, but it should be destroyed by an equitable society where some of those profits are returned to workers. We need to reject this kind of reification of the current structure, again, as something that we can either have or we can have something that's completely different. We can have totalizing capitalism, that the best we can possibly do is redistribute our oil funds to working people and moms, or we have full-on revolution. That's probably not going to happen in our lifetime. Those are the only two things that we can do. And we should reject that to say that society is about social relations. And social relations are at the core of how society functions. And when you shift your social relations, you shift your economic relations. And this is the MMT view, that money is limitless. Money is not a thing that has a restriction. It's literally made up out of whole cloth. Money is the government determining where it wants demand to go in the economy. It's saying we want to be an economy that produces X, Y, and Z, so we're going to create the money to do that. So under such a view, which is empirically correct, we can then say we are going to socially produce something else. We can re-envision this system. And one thing to note here too is to bring in a little bit of Foucault, who critiques Marxists for treating power like a commodity. This is important too, especially this Nietzschean left, especially of like this TrueAnon crowd who is so focused on Jeffrey Epstein as if Jeffrey Epstein was this individual figure that had an enormous amount of power. Foucault says that's not how power works. It's not a commodity. It's not something that you get and then can hold on to and exercise over people. It's not something that can be exchanged between people and then it's like a fixed amount, right? It's a network. Capitalism doesn't end if we guillotine Jeff Bezos or figure out the Jeffrey Epstein controversy. Those people don't possess the commodity of power. They're embedded within networks and social relations that allow them to coerce people to do things they don't want to do. And let's analogize social relations to the economy. And this is just an analogy. This isn't how I think things actually work. But when we have these equal, non-power laden social relations, they create value. And then society receives the surplus. When a conversation happens and knowledge is gained, and this has been true throughout history, society gets the benefits of that. Nobody's able to accrue, an exceptional, ridiculous amount of knowledge from conversations and then store it and hoard it for long periods of time. So they just rack up so much knowledge that they have so much extra power because they've been able to extract knowledge from others. In this case, surplus value cannot be accumulated, and these are the type of social relations we want. But neoliberalism makes social interactions and social reproduction into a marketplace as well. So you actually are trying to extract value out of somebody when you have a conversation with them. That you actually are trying to extract value out of people when you have relations with them. Our entire social schema now has been one that has been neoliberalized so that people try to get things out of each other, because that's the only way to succeed in society. You have to constantly be hustling. Capitalism is a hustle, and if you aren't running along with it, you're going to fall behind. So everybody's trying to hustle all the time, and we're trying to see how many things that we can extract value out of. This is what Jordan Peterson argues for. He argues for even more neoliberalism. You should be even more extractive from people. That all that matters is your individual will, and therefore, the only thing that matters to you in relations with other people is to see how much you can get out of them. On the same note, I also want to see a break from this self-interest nonsense, right? There's so much of this, even on the left, this idea that we have to appeal to people based on their self-interest. What do I get out of this? It's a zero-sum game, and the only way to win people over is to make sure they know they're getting something out of this. So I think my personal example is a good one here to discuss this, right? Like, for me, capitalism works okay. I'm probably in the top 5 or 10% because I figured out how to navigate institutions under the system, right? Obviously, I'm in a PhD program that's supposed to pave the way to a decent paying job. But I don't care. Every single day, I get closer and closer to this position. I get more and more dedicated to helping working people. Because I'm not self-interested. Because I wake up and I think about people that I know and people that I don't know and what they're going through. And when I see somebody who's homeless on the street, my heart breaks every single time. And when a friend tells me a story of anything from going through emotional distress to a serious injury for which they can't afford their medical bills, my heart breaks. And this is what I think about when I wake up in the morning. And I'm probably further on the empathy spectrum than some other people, right? Obviously, there is something of a spectrum here. I know some selfish people. People can probably all relate to a former roommate or something who did things only for themselves, who didn't really care about you. That exists for sure. But people are way more empathetic than we give them credit for. People care more about just themselves. Socialism isn't about self-interest, it's about the opposite. So again, if you think about the end goal, of socialism being social productions that are equal, social relations that are equal, we shouldn't try to get there by saying, hey, the reason that you should support socialism is because it makes you economically better off. That's not to say they shouldn't be in our toolkit. Of course it should be, right? We want to appeal to working people who are in distress because they're alienated. That's important too. But that alienation point is important. We're not really necessarily worried about raising people's wages, at least not on its own, because as Karl Polanyi points out, when people are dislocated economically, it's not felt in their bank account. It's felt in their personal life. Your bank account hitting a zero doesn't mean anything. What matters is how you have to adjust your life to deal with that. Can you eat food? Can you go to a friend's place? Do you have to engage in some desperate behavior just to stay alive, just to stay comfortable, just to feed your family? That's what we care about. We care about social relations. If we could eliminate money in production, that would be ideal, because then we would just be focused on how people interact with one another. As it so happens, production is necessary and will be for the foreseeable future. But our end goal is still the same. It's to make people's relations between each other as equal as possible. And what we recognize is that when one person has more money than another person, that is an area, not the only one in the true Foucault sense, but an area where power dynamics arise. But really our goal is to end power dynamics. That's our North Star. It's about how we relate to one another. It's not about the money in our bank account. It's not about our wages. It's not even necessarily about the hours that we work. Would we like to live in a society where we work 4 hours a week? Of course. But if we end up in a society where we all have to work 30 hours a week, but that work is leading to fulfilling social interactions and nobody has to suffer or need for anything, that's fine. Because in such a society, those 30 hours of work will be fulfilling because they are a social relation too. And if they're equal social relations, then 30 hours a week will be just like that extra 26 hours a week you would spend at home in the 4 hours a week world, because your work life is fun. You just happen to be doing something else. But production isn't a drag. Production is a social task that you do with people that you care about for the betterment of a society. We can't be a left that's focused on self-interest and will to power. And I think one of our guiding lights here, and I've been going back and forth a little bit between critiquing Bernie Sanders and praising what he did for us, but ultimately I have much stronger feeling towards the latter. I think it's unfortunate what he's done since he dropped out, but it doesn't really matter in some sense. Bernie Sanders and the BLM movement in recent months have showed us the way in a lot of ways, in terms of movements that have built solidarity, that have actually been built not on self-interest, but on fighting for somebody else. There's all these critiques in the media of like, oh, this BLM movement in this city was filled with white activists. Great. That's amazing. Especially if they're willing to actually be in the fight. Especially with, as the tear gas starts coming out, if they're willing to stand there and take it because they believe in the cause. Fan-fucking-tastic. Hope there's more white people out there. That would be great. That's solidarity. It's really beautiful. It really is. I know a lot of white people who risked life and limb to go out on the streets and fight for Black lives. The idea that people on the left were critiquing this, and let me tell you, there is a lot of leftists who think that BLM is not worthwhile, think it's a bourgeois liberal movement, and think that it shouldn't be done because it's not class-based. It's not of the left because it's not class-based. If you don't think that white people being willing to be tear-gassed for something that doesn't actually affect them, because they're outraged at Black people being killed in the streets by police, if you don't think that's the basis of a movement for solidarity, then I don't know what to tell you. And this is why I say solidarity, not homogeneity. What I mean by that too is that there's also sort of an implicit at the end of that, also not heterogeneity. So here's what I mean by that, right? On the liberal side, society is built of individuals and groups. And so here's what I mean by heterogeneity, where we can't possibly see crossover between a trans movement and a Black Lives Matter movement, because those are two separate domains, right? This is what Kimberly Crenshaw was essentially trying to get at in a sort of liberal way herself when she discussed intersectionality. Intersectionality being the idea that there's two roads crossing. One is, say, race, and one is, say, gender. The intersection is blind to our society in many ways. Literally, in terms of law, people have filed discrimination lawsuits for a workplace not hiring Black women, and the court has said, well, they hire Black people, they hire women, so we can't say they're discriminating against Black women, even though that's the intersection, right? You can have a workplace that hires 10 Black men and 10 white women, but 0 Black women. But they'll be seen as hiring their diversity quota of Black people and women, right? This is the idea of Kimberly Crenshaw. And obviously, I think this idea, the way that she lays it out is somewhat problematic, but I think that we should absolutely stick with it and adopt it for the left. I love the term intersectionality. I think it's actually very descriptive and very important. And the way that I think of this is essentially like, when we think about intersectionality, we're a little bit too zoomed in. And if we zoomed out, what we'd see is that overlying all of this is a superhighway of class. So underlying any social interaction, any social relation is class. That's just fundamentally true, right? What position do you hold in terms of your income? Obviously, that's important. That's just how society functions. Maybe in some future, utopic vision. We won't have to worry about how much people make, but like clearly class underlies all of our social relations, or maybe overlies is a better word. But intersectionality is still important. And in fact, it makes the analysis more complex. It makes it more complex to say you're a black woman who's also poor. That's a further complexity that to me is even more important. I don't care if you're Oprah Winfrey and you're not seen in the intersection. I don't give a shit. I care if you're a working black woman. So basically what Crenshaw is attacking is the heterogeneity of her fellow liberals, of people who think that these groups and individuals are separate. And I think that like implicit in our leftism is just that that's nonsense. Like that's a starting place. But it's important to note, right? There definitely is a liberal left. And I guess more importantly, a group of people on the left who have tried to essentially turn these radical ideologies of based around identity, which I'm not trying to be sarcastic here. I literally mean like, so for example, like I read radical race theory, but radical race theory, if it doesn't include class, which some of it does not, is not leftism, right? It's sort of radical liberalism, and that has a place for sure. But if you're not critiquing capitalism and you're just talking about race, it doesn't really matter how far you go. Like this is Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates says, in many ways, more radical things about race than almost anybody on the socialist left. Because he thinks race is so deeply underlying social relations that it defines literally everything about our society. But that's not leftism. That's where liberalism falls short. So definitely not heterogeneity, definitely not individualized or group subjects. But also, on the other hand, not homogeneity. We're not just a blob of a working class that only cares about our material conditions. The correct approach is intersectional solidarity that includes class, that recognizes that we're not self-interested actors, that we care about each other, that people face all kinds of oppressions, that all of those oppressions in our current system have an underlying economic component to them, but that does not make them economic. That social relations have to be redefined through solidarity. And only once we redefine social relations through solidarity can we actually then begin fixing some of these broader problems in our society. Because ultimately our goal is equality in the deepest sense of the word, which means equality for me and everybody who doesn't look like me. And that requires that I recognize your struggle as something qualitatively, but not quantitatively different from my struggle. Qualitatively different in the sense that I can't know what it's like to be trans, and maybe you can't know what it's like to be black. And exploring these differences is how we recognize the humanity of all. Quantitatively the same, because we're all subject to this awful set of social relations that both define and are defined by our current iteration of neoliberal capitalism. That we're all locked into the same system such that when a white cis man stands shoulder to shoulder with a trans black woman, they both recognize that the Foucaultian power dynamic between the two is not the fault of either, but the product of a system. Solidarity in the fact that all of these things are dialectically in motion, that ideas matter, that none of these things are fixed in time and space, and that everything that you do, big or small, to smash power differentials and create equitable and mutually beneficial social relations is moving us towards socialism, which is a process, not an outcome. This includes radicalizing your friends, donating to bail funds, marching for Black lives, writing and organizing for prison abolition, union drives, and yes, calling your senators on the slim chance that women won't have their abortion rights taken away, or black people retain their voting rights, or trans people don't lose all workplace non-discrimination protections. This doesn't take away from revolutionary Marxist politics, which says the entire system must be done away with and rebuilt. It adds to it and makes it more likely. It ensures not just that society redistributes wealth to the working class in society, but that society is actually one we would want to live in. Okay, I think that's all I got. You should leave us a 5-star review on the podcast app that you're using. We have too little of those. If you have a friend or partner, you should just steal their phone and give us a 5-star on there. We need more reviews so more people can find the show.